So, as like the inevitable reality of superhero fatigue sets in, I think the question is whether like general audiences are growing tired of like comic book stories in general, or merely just the brand of mostly uninspired stories that seem to have been told in the last couple of years. The answer is probably a mixture of both, but Fantastic Four is hoping to prove that there are still some exciting tales to tell within the increasingly crowded genre. Does it succeed? I have seen it, so let's talk about it. So the answer to that question, at least to me, is yes. I think this movie is really fun, and I say that as someone who has been personally pretty burnt out from superhero movies. Boasting a really stellar cast, a delightful throwback kind of like tone and aesthetic, and a surprisingly earnest like pro-family and pro-life message, Fantastic Four is just a really enjoyable comic book film, and I think a very intriguing foundation for the future of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. After the pleasant surprise of Thunderbolts, aka the new Avengers, which released earlier this year, and which I also happen to enjoy quite a bit, Fantastic Four feels like another very purposeful like recalibration of sort of the floundering MCU, at least like post Avengers Endgame, because the film forgoes much of like the cheap spectacle almost to a fault in favor of compelling character drama, and it kind of narrows its focus to the heroes at hand rather than like hijacking their journeys just to build towards and like, establish a dozen other future movies or TV shows. Kind of refreshingly, at least to me, Fantastic Four feels like a very captivating like Fantastic Four story, and not just like chapter 36 of the increasingly bloated MCU. And I think the film's more focused approach works in large part because of the strength of its central heroes. The characters are all perfectly cast, and I think have a very compelling and like, unique relational dynamic. Kind of like despite the ever-expanding pantheon of cinematic superheroes, the four members of the Fantastic Four team all managed to kind of find and fill some unoccupied space on the roster. And by that, I mean that like while Marvel superheroes tend to represent big kind of universal qualities of morality and goodness, they seldom have represented one of life's most like foundational experiences, which is being a part of a family. Like the ones that have had family attachments are either framed as like a negative, such as Thor and Loki, or kind of more as like a fringe afterthought, kind of a la Hawkeye. In contrast, Fantastic Four puts a very welcome emphasis on family with heroes who are also husbands and wives and parents and siblings. I think as a result, even though obviously one of the heroes is like a big giant rock creature and another one is a super genius who can stretch his body, to me the characters still feel like more like real people than many of the other kind of superpowered peers. Fantastic Four is also, I think, kind of a sort of fun throwback film, really in like more ways than one, because like the retro futuristic kind of 1960s aesthetic proved to be one of this film's most like inspired creative choices, because it's just such a fun setting and just instantly gives this film a very like, distinctive look and atmosphere. And beyond just sort of like the aesthetics, the movie also feels like a throwback to like earlier and perhaps simpler days of the genre, because there's a playful and like almost unashamedly like goofy quality to the story, almost like one of those like old school Saturday morning cartoons come to life, which is like a connection that I made within the film itself. Because the film is like not only like set within kind of a 1960s inspired era, but it also approaches the genre in like a earnest manner that I think is like befitting of the time, lacking any trace of sort of the cynical tone or like sarcastic humor that seems to have like crept into the MCU's later phases and that I just personally have become tired of. For all of its charms, however, I don't think that like everything about this film works perfectly. Fantastic Four forgoes a lot of like the mindless spectacle of other recent comic book films, or even just blockbuster films in general, but it perhaps allows the pendulum to swing like, just a little bit too far in the other direction, because there's definitely some sort of like inconsistent pacing here and also a lack of action. And there's like a repeated gag in the movie where the Thing refuses to use his classic catchphrase, "It's clobbering time." And I think kind of in like a meta sense, the the movie feels equally as reluctant at times to deliver sort of those crowd-pleasing action and moments. Because it's not really until like this film's climax that the team fully utilizes their unique powers in the same sort of like escapist comic book movie sort of ways. Instead, they give inspirational speeches and press conferences, or else engage in like scientific research at their headquarters, with kind of like their superpowers almost being an afterthought and like their true strength deriving from their noble character. And like, to be clear, I really like that idea on like a thematic level, but it's just not always as thrilling on like a cinematic one. And maybe I'm just a simple man, but sometimes I just want to see my superheroes punch some bad guys. And speaking of bad guys, kind of as for our big baddie, Galactus, I think is a menacing threat, and I think is used kind of effectively, but he's also just a little bit too like distant and like overpowering to be utilized very often in the story. And instead, that responsibility mostly falls on the character of Silver Surfer. Now, I know there's also been a lot of like online chatter about the decision to like gender swap the traditionally male character. And granted, I'm not by any means like a comic book purist, but I actually really liked the version of the character in this movie. And I actually think that the film could have used more of her, since she does have some very interesting and kind of complicated motivations. And I think maybe more importantly, the decision to make the character a woman also establishes a really interesting contrast with Sue Storm and fits with the central theme of motherhood. As far as content to consider, things going on the surface of this, really not a whole lot. For language, there are only a few, 3 to 4 minor profanities, although I will say the names of God and Jesus are also both used multiple times. For violence, nothing beyond kind of the typical standard bloodless comic book action. For sexuality, this may just depend on what your expectations are. Kind of like the sculpted form of Silver Surfer does lead a character to refer to her multiple times as a sexy alien, or else like a naked space alien, although others like correctly point out that she is not in fact actually naked. And like obviously I think there is an intentional like kind of sensuality quality to the character, but I did not personally find her to be like overly sexualized. As far as other sort of like content stuff to be to take note of, there is almost a surprising amount of like religious and like spiritual allusions, because at one point Reed discusses a strategy that will require them to move heaven and earth, and in context he means to literally move the earth, before he adds, well, just the earth, which is kind of a rare acknowledgement just of a spiritual reality in the MCU. And later you have characters kind of wonder if Galactus is in fact a god. And there's even several scenes that are set like either outside or like within of a synagogue, which is just to me like a rare inclusion of like kind of like real world religion and faith in the MCU. As far as themes, worldview, things going on beneath the surface, I actually think there's a lot of really fascinating things really going on all throughout this movie. Because superheroes, they typically kind of represent an ideal of virtue and like self-sacrifice, but there's also a sense in which they can almost embody a sort of like selfish, individualistic fantasy, because they tend to sort of be the eternal bachelor, kind of never settling down or putting down roots while living the life of danger and excitement, kind of without the everyday responsibilities of family or life. Where in contrast, in this film, Reed Richards, aka Mr. Fantastic, may be the first superhero in the MCU who has to like set aside his superhero duties to go change a dirty diaper. And I think kind of as a whole, this film plays out almost as a sort of extended metaphor for like childbirth and parenting, because significantly, like the opening scene of this film is the discovery of Sue's pregnancy, which is significantly, I think, followed by kind of like a recounting of their superhero origin story and how their like unexpected powers radically changed the course of the life that they previously had imagined for themselves. And the actual like birth scene later in the film then like occurs kind of simultaneously as their spacecraft like skirts around the fringe of a black hole, like narrowly, avoiding being sucked in. And I think in perhaps the film's most like striking bit of like visual storytelling, as the child is born, Sue Storm kind of loses control of her powers and just momentarily becomes invisible, which I personally took to be kind of symbolic of just a woman losing kind of some of her previous identity and then being like reborn as a mother. In the end, however, kind of despite the fear of losing herself, Sue does find like newfound strength and purpose through her like maternal bond to her child. And like ultimately she declares to a crowd of bystanders. She says, I won't abandon my child for the sake of the world, but I won't abandon the world for the sake of my child. And it's kind of through the lens of parenthood. The film just explores that, difficult tension of, individual versus sort of communal identity in ways that most superhero films just simply never touch. The movie also has, I think, a very strong, pro-life component, because the central narrative tension revolves around Galactus, who offers to spare devouring Earth in exchange for Reed and Sue's newborn child, an offer which I think notably is made while the child is still in the womb. And as crowds of people on Earth protest and kind of callously call for the sacrifice of the child, a desperate Reed briefly considers the idea, calling it mathematical, ethical, and available. And kind of the evil of those words is quickly exposed by the sound of the baby's cries. And he realizes that there is no gain that justifies the sacrifice of a child. And later, when Sue confronts those angry mobs and introduces them to her precious child, they quickly lose their resolve. And it's clear that their worldview and arguments maybe sounded sensible in abstract, but quickly crumble when forced to actually look upon the beauty of a newborn life. So in the end, I think whether the MCU is already too far down the tracks to change course remains to be seen. But I think Fantastic Four's really long-awaited introduction is a successful one. I think the film reminds audiences just of the potential of the superhero genre when the focus is put on compelling characters and their emotional journeys, and not just on flashy spectacle or the complicated mechanics of maintaining a big shared universe. Fantastic Four may not be among the most inventive or dynamic comic book films, but I think it is exactly the type of film that Marvel needs right now to hold some of that superhero fatigue at bay. The film's subtitle is First Steps, and this does indeed feel like an exciting new beginning for the series to go forward with these characters as the centerpieces. But hey, I would love to hear what you guys think. If you enjoyed the film as much as I did, or maybe you're just too far gone and burnt out from superhero films, be respectful, but don't be shy. Jump into the comment section. Let's have a conversation about it. If you haven't listened to, encourage you guys, subscribe to the channel, become a Collider. Got lots of other movie reviews, got our Faith and Pop Culture podcast, got interviews, just other fun stuff. Would love to have you guys be a part of that. But most of all, guys, thank you for watching. Stay safe and continue to collide through World for Christ.